Jagged cliffs bit John's feet. Below, the water hammered against the stone, a relentless, rhythmic thud that vibrated through his bones. The salt air was thick, stinging his skin and coating his throat with the taste of brine. He held the scroll of rough parchment tight. There was no one else for miles. Only the wind, which tore across the plateau with a high, whistling shriek, and the vast, empty horizon. He shifted his weight, testing the stability of the rock beneath him. He looked down at the blank surface of the parchment. The clouds were gathering in heavy, bruised layers, pressing down on the island. He smoothed the paper, his fingers tracing the grain. The air grew heavy, static building until the hair on his arms stood up. He dipped his quill, the ink dark and viscous, and held it poised. He was ready. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized, waiting to break. He did not know that the horizon he watched was about to shatter. The ground did not just shake, it groaned. A deep, tectonic vibration surged upward through the soles of his feet, throwing John off balance. He dropped his quill. The ink splattered against the stone like a dark stain. Then, the sound of the sea vanished, replaced by a roar like 1,000 crashing waves. He spun around, his hands scrambling for purchase on the jagged rock. 7 golden lampstands erupted from the earth, burning with a light that hurt his eyes. They formed a perfect, blinding circle. In the center, a figure coalesced from the very air. His eyes were not merely bright, they burned with the intensity of molten iron, searing through the gloom. His feet glowed with a dull, heavy luster of polished bronze. A sharp blade seemed to hang in the air before his lips. John tried to stand, but his legs failed him. He collapsed into the dust, his face pressed hard against the cold, unyielding stone, his breath hitching in his chest. The terror was absolute. Then, a weight settled on his shoulder. It was not the weight of a hand, but a steady, radiating heat that seeped through his skin and into his bones. The fear began to recede, replaced by a sudden, jarring stillness. "Fear not," the voice resonated, not in his ears, but directly within his mind. John looked up, his vision clearing. John scrambled to his feet, his fingers trembling as he dipped the quill. The figure spoke, and the words flowed onto the parchment, each stroke heavy with intent. He scribbled the 7 letters, his mind racing to keep pace with the cadence of the voice. But as the final letter was etched, the atmosphere changed. The air above the cliffs began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth. Suddenly, the sky did not just darken, it split. A jagged, blinding fissure tore through the clouds, widening until the horizon of Patmos vanished entirely. In its place, a vast, luminous expanse opened. A throne dominated the center, radiating a light that made the sun seem dim. Surrounding it, 24 figures sat in silence, their presence heavy and ancient. 4 creatures moved in the periphery, their wings beating in a rhythm that sounded like the turning of the world. They circled the throne, their eyes fixed on the center. John felt the cold stone of the island slip away, replaced by a sense of infinite height. He stood on a floor that shimmered like glass. The scale of the space was impossible. He looked at the throne, his breath caught in his throat. The one seated there held a scroll, sealed with 7 layers of wax. The silence in the room was absolute. The scroll remained untouched. John watched the throne, his eyes darting from the elders to the creatures, waiting for a sign. The silence grew heavy, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He looked at the wax seals, their edges sharp and unbroken. No one moved. The elders remained motionless, their faces unreadable. The creatures continued their rhythmic circling, their wings cutting the air. John felt the cold reality settle into his marrow. The scroll was sealed, and it would remain that way. He dropped his head, his shoulders sagging. A sob tore through his throat, then another. He wept, the sound echoing in the vast, hollow space of the celestial chamber. Then, the rhythm of the room shifted. A new presence moved toward the center. John wiped his eyes and looked up. A lamb walked forward, its gait steady and deliberate. As it drew closer, John saw the marks on its side, deep, jagged scars. The lamb did not hesitate. It reached the throne, its presence anchoring the space. The tension that had gripped the room snapped. The lamb pressed a hoof against the first seal. It snapped, with the sound of a bone breaking. Across the horizon, a white horse erupted into view, its stride covering leagues in a single beat. The rider held a bow, his eyes fixed on a distant target. The second seal shattered. A red horse galloped out, its hooves striking sparks against the firmament. The rider swung a massive blade, the air whistling as it cut through the silence. John watched, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The third seal gave way. A black horse appeared, its coat absorbing the light of the chamber. The rider held a pair of scales, the balance tipping with every movement. Then, the fourth seal broke. A pale horse emerged, its form flickering like dying embers. Death sat upon its back, a shadow cast across the expanse. The ground beneath the throne shuddered. These four forces fanned out, tearing across the landscape. Conquest, war, famine, and death. John reached for his quill, but his hand hung frozen in the air. The world he knew was dissolving, replaced by the relentless advance of the four riders. The fifth seal broke. A chorus of voices rose from beneath the altar, a desperate, piercing cry for justice that vibrated through the very foundation of the throne room. John covered his ears, but the sound cut through, sharp and relentless. Then, the lamb turned to the sixth seal. It snapped. The reaction was instantaneous. The earth beneath John's feet buckled, a violent tremor that sent stone dust billowing into the air. Above, the sky did not just darken, it tore. The sun turned black, a void in the center of the firmament, while the moon bled a deep, viscous red. Stars detached from their fixed points, falling toward the earth like overripe fruit shaken from a dying tree. The atmosphere grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone. John watched as the horizon disintegrated. The mountains shifted, their peaks grinding against one another with a sound like shattering glass. Panic erupted below. People who had once stood tall now scrambled into the dark mouths of caves, their fingers clawing at the jagged rock faces. John pressed his back against the cold stone, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the ceiling of the world began to cave in. The seventh seal broke. Silence fell, absolute and heavy, before 7 angels stepped forward. They held 7 trumpets, their metal surfaces dull in the light of the throne. The first angel raised his instrument and blew. A blast of hail and fire erupted from the sky, slamming into the earth with the force of a falling mountain. The ground scorched, turning to ash beneath the heat. The second angel sounded his trumpet. A massive peak, burning with liquid flame, crashed into the churning sea. The water hissed, turning to blood as the tide surged against the shore. John watched the horizon boil. The third angel blew. A star, trailing smoke like a jagged spear, plummeted from the firmament and struck the rivers. The fresh water turned bitter, thick with the taste of wormwood. Then, the fourth angel raised his trumpet. The sky shuddered. The sun dimmed, its light drained away, and the moon vanished into a shroud of gray. John stood amidst the ruin, his hands trembling as he gripped the parchment. The earth was scarred, the waters were tainted, and the heavens had retreated into shadow. The fifth trumpet sounded. A shaft of light pierced the abyss, and the ground groaned. From the dark opening, a swarm rose, thick as smoke. These were no ordinary insects. They possessed the faces of men and the long, segmented tails of scorpions. Their wings beat with a sound like 1,000 chariots rushing into battle. They descended upon the earth. Then, the sixth trumpet tore through the silence. The earth shuddered again, and the river Euphrates dried to cracked mud. From the east, the horizon filled with movement. 200 million horsemen emerged, a tide of iron and fury. They rode beasts that breathed fire, smoke, and sulfur. The riders wore breastplates that glowed with the heat of a forge. John watched from the cliff, his knuckles white as he gripped the scroll. The world was a furnace of swarming legs and trampling hooves. The thunder of hooves died away, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. John stood on the cliff, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Above the ruined landscape, the sky tore open once more. A figure descended, wrapped in a cloud, a rainbow arching over his head like a crown of light. He held a small, tightly rolled scroll in his hand. He landed on the earth, his presence dwarfing the surrounding wreckage. "Take it," the angel commanded, his voice vibrating through the very stone beneath John's feet. "Eat it." John hesitated, then reached out. His fingers brushed the parchment, cool and dry. He unrolled it and placed the edge against his tongue. It tasted of pure honey, a sweetness that flooded his senses and masked the scent of ash. He swallowed. The relief was instantaneous, but it did not last. As the scroll settled in his stomach, the sweetness curdled. A sharp, burning ache radiated outward, twisting his insides like a physical weight. It was a cold, heavy bitterness that anchored itself deep within him. John doubled over, gripping his midsection, his eyes watering. He had consumed the prophecy, and now it resided in his marrow. He forced himself upright, his legs trembling. John turned his eyes toward the temple, his stride heavy with the weight of the scroll. At the gate, two figures stood, draped in coarse, abrasive fabric. They did not speak to the crowds. They spoke to the heavens. For 1,260 days, their voices rose like a storm, unyielding and sharp. They commanded the sky to withhold rain and turn the waters into blood. The earth trembled at their words, but the rebellion was brewing in the dark. From the depths of the abyss, a shadow coalesced into a form of jagged, shifting malice. The beast surged upward, its presence tearing through the air like a blade. It reached the gate, its claws striking with the force of a falling mountain. The two prophets fell, their voices silenced in an instant. Their bodies lay motionless on the stone, exposed to the mocking gaze of the city. 3 days passed in a suffocating, unnatural stillness. Then, the impossible happened. A breath of life stirred the dust. The prophets stood, their eyes fixed on a point beyond the horizon. A sound like a trumpet blast echoed from the clouds, and they rose, pulled upward by an unseen force. They vanished into the sky, leaving the beast to howl at the empty air. The sky above the temple dissolved, replaced by a blinding, radiant expanse. A woman appeared in the center of the light, her body strained in the agony of labor. She cried out, her voice echoing across the firmament. Before her, a shadow blotted out the brilliance. A massive red dragon, its 7 heads snapping and snarling, coiled itself in the air. It waited, eyes fixed on the woman, muscles coiled to strike the moment the child emerged. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and sulfur. Then, the silence shattered. A roar erupted from the heights as Michael and his legions descended like a falling star. The clash was absolute. Wings beat against wings, and blades of light carved through the darkness. The dragon thrashed, its tail sweeping across the stars, but the angelic host pressed forward with relentless force. They grappled, limbs locking, the force of their impact sending ripples through the fabric of the sky. With a final, crushing blow, the dragon was torn from its perch. It plummeted, a streak of crimson fire falling toward the earth. The dragon struck the earth with a sound like shattering stone. Before the dust could settle, the sea began to churn. A beast rose from the churning surf, its body a mass of iron-hard scales and shifting heads. It stood on the shore, its presence forcing the tides to retreat. Then, the ground beneath the mountains cracked open. A second beast crawled from the earth, Its horns curved like a ram. It spoke with the voice of a dragon, its words vibrating through the very soil. The two entities moved in unison, their influence spreading like a plague. They demanded a sign, a mark etched into the skin of every person. It appeared on the right hand or the forehead, a searing brand that burned with the heat of the abyss. Merchants stopped trading. Cities went silent. The mark became the only currency of survival. People stood in long, desperate lines, their eyes fixed on the ground as the beasts stalked through the streets. To refuse was to be cast out. To accept was to surrender the soul. Families huddled in the shadows, watching the mark glow on their own skin, realizing the world had been carved into two. The beasts stood at the center of the chaos. 7 angels stepped from the temple, each holding a golden bowl filled with the fury of the heavens. The first angel tilted his bowl toward the sea. The water did not ripple. It thickened. Within seconds, the blue expanse turned to a dark, viscous red. Fish floated to the surface, their scales dull, as the tide washed blood onto the sand. The second angel poured his bowl upon the rivers. The water boiled, steam rising in choking clouds that stung the lungs of everyone nearby. The third angel struck the earth. The soil cracked, and the heat intensified until the grass withered into gray ash. People ran for the shade, but the sun flared, its light turning into a physical weight that scorched the skin. The fourth angel poured his bowl into the air. The atmosphere ignited. Fire rained down, not in drops, but in sheets of flame that consumed the remaining forests. The fifth angel struck the seat of the beasts. The roar of the falling mountains died away, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Then, the earth beneath the great city of Babylon shifted. It was not a slow decay. The ground simply gave way. Massive stone walls, built to endure for centuries, cracked from the base to the summit. The sound of grinding rock filled the air as the city began to sink into the abyss. Iron gates buckled, twisting into useless metal ribbons. The marketplaces, once the center of global trade, collapsed into deep, jagged fissures. Merchants dropped their goods, watching as the ground swallowed their wealth. The towers leaned, then shattered, sending plumes of dust high into the stagnant sky. There was no resistance. The systems that had governed the world for generations snapped like dry twigs. Stone crumbled into fine gray powder. The streets vanished. Every structure, every monument, and every foundation was reduced to dust. The vacuum left behind was absolute. The wind picked up, carrying the grit of the fallen city across the barren plains. The collapse was total, leaving the horizon clear for the final arrival. The sky above the ruins did not merely clear. It tore open. A blinding, steady light poured down, forcing the dust of the fallen city to settle. From the rift, a white horse descended, its hooves striking the air as if it were solid ground. The rider sat motionless, his eyes burning with a heat that outmatched the sun. He did not speak, yet the air vibrated with his presence. Behind him, the clouds parted to reveal an endless line of riders, their movement a single, rhythmic pulse. The beast, seeing the arrival, turned to rally his remaining forces, but his command died in his throat. He looked toward the rider and froze. The false prophet beside him stumbled, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to hold onto a power that had already vanished. The rider on the white horse did not break stride. He reached the center of the plain, and the armies of heaven swarmed around him like a closing net. There was no struggle. The beast and the false prophet were seized by unseen hands, their resistance snapping instantly. They were dragged toward the edge of the abyss. With a single motion, they were cast into the lake of fire. The flames rose to meet them, swallowing their forms in a roar of white-hot light. An angel descended, holding a heavy iron chain. He moved toward the abyss, where the darkness churned like thick oil. Satan did not fight. He was bound in the cold, unyielding metal and cast into the pit. The stone lid slammed shut, sealing the world in a long, hollow silence. 1,000 years ticked by like a slow pulse. Then, the seal cracked. The stone lid groaned and slid aside. Satan climbed from the depths, his presence a sudden, sharp pressure. He moved across the earth, whispering to the nations, drawing them into a vast, silent march. They gathered at the edges of the city, a sea of steel and shadows, their weapons glinting in the dim light. As the armies reached the threshold, the sky above them turned white. There was no warning. Fire poured down from the clouds. The weapons melted, the banners turned to ash, and the soldiers were swept away. The fire did not stop until the plain was empty. The blackened earth beneath the city began to tremble, not with the force of war, but with a sudden, absolute stillness. The ground parted, and a throne of blinding, polished white stone rose into the air. It was so vast that the horizon seemed to shrink in its presence. No one sat upon it at first, yet the air around it hummed with weight. Then, the books appeared. They were not made of paper, but of light, their pages turning in the windless air. From the dust of the earth, the dead began to rise, standing in an endless, silent column that stretched toward the throne. One by one, they stepped forward. The books opened, revealing the record of every life, every action, every choice. The final book, the Book of Life, was held open before the throne. When the last name was read, the shadow of death itself detached from the world. It was seized and cast into the lake of fire. The flames flared, consuming the darkness, and the old world ceased to exist. The void left by the old world did not remain empty for long. A new horizon stretched out, clean and vast, where the sky and the earth met, in a seamless line of light. The air tasted of ozone and fresh water. From the heights of the new heavens, a city began to descend. It did not fall. It drifted downward with the weight of a mountain, its structure glowing with a steady, pulsing brilliance. As it drew closer, the architecture revealed itself. The walls were constructed of solid, translucent jasper, catching the light and refracting it into a spectrum of colors. 12 gates stood at the perimeter, each carved from a single, massive pearl that shimmered with an iridescent, milky sheen. The streets were paved with gold, so pure and polished that they mirrored the light radiating from the center of the city. There was no sun to cast shadows. The light came from within, a constant, pervasive glow that illuminated every corner. The angel stood by the gates, his presence fading as the light of the city settled into a steady, eternal glow. He pointed toward the horizon, his hand steady, his expression fixed. "These words are true," he said. The voice did not just sound in the air. It vibrated in the stone beneath John's feet. John knelt, his hands trembling as he reached for the parchment. The angel pulled him upright, a firm, grounding grip that pulled him back from the edge of the vision. Then, the final sound arrived, a low, resonant echo. "I am coming soon." John did not look back. He took the rough edges of the scroll and began to roll it tight, the dry parchment rasping against his palms. He secured the binding, the weight of the record heavy in his grip. He turned away from the shimmering gates and walked toward the edge of the cliff. The wind of Patmos hit him, cold and sharp against his skin. He looked out at the dark, empty horizon. The vision remained, burned into his mind.